Okay, so I'm going to talk about how our scenarios, the key themes from our scenarios were interpreted by a range of focus groups that we ran. So I'll tell you a little bit about the makeup of those focus groups and the kind of topics that we prompted them about, the responses that our different focus groups gave to the key themes from the scenarios before coming to some key messages. So in order to select the participants for the focus groups, we used mosaic Experian data to identify areas with high, middle and low carbon footprints in the Greater Manchester area. We then selected male and female groups from each of those high, middle and low. And then within the focus groups, we moved from the kind of much more generic things about what are people's favourite foods, what are their current shopping habits, through to the general issue of sustainability before moving on to these key themes that we picked out from our scenarios. And those key themes that we spoke about were to do with different mitigation and adaptation strategies. So we spoke about seasonality, and by that we spoke about foods available within the UK. We talked about reducing meat consumption, the role of lab meat or meal replacement tablets, which features in lab chops, communal eating and GM. And obviously we could discuss the extent to which those are parts of what you guys think is a sustainable diet, and those things are obviously open for debate. But within the scenarios, those were the options that we'd selected, and therefore we wanted to get a reaction from consumers to the kinds of futures that we were talking about. So I'm just going to give you a quick flavour of what the kinds of things our respondents said. So in terms of seasonality, there's widespread confusion about seasonality, about what was a seasonal product, and more information requested on what things are available at certain times of the year from the UK. And also, coupled with that, a desire for greater awareness of seasonal recipes. So what are the foods that we could be eating that would be more seasonal, and what could we do with those foods to maintain a kind of interesting and exciting diet? Also, some parents in the groups queried whether there was enough variety offered if you only ate food from the UK. So the kinds of things people were saying about that. I'd be hard pushed to know what was British and in season at any one point. I don't feel that I'm educated enough to know what I'd be able to pick up. So that kind of captured what a lot of people said about just really not knowing what was in season because everything's always available. And then the second quote there picks up on an even more sort of disconnected relationship with seasonality, where somebody says, I can sort of relate to that, seasonality, with Cadbury's cream eggs. They're semi-seasonal. They tried bringing them out for Halloween. It didn't really work because it was green. But Cadbury's cream eggs, they're seasonal, and that's the only way I can relate back to it. You said that's how it used to be with seasonal food. That's the only seasonal food I know, and it sounds stupid, it really does, but it genuinely is. So when asked to think of things that they could only get at certain times of the year, some, by no means all, some of our respondents really could only think of things they couldn't actually get were things like mince pies and Easter eggs. Okay, so then we asked about meat consumption, about a 20% reduction in meat, a 70% reduction in meat, as you'll see in the scenarios. And all of the discussion here took place in the kind of context of rising food prices, the recession, people already feeling that they were making reductions in the amount of meat that they ate. Again, like with seasonality, there's a sense that there's a lack of knowledge of meat-free recipes, with one respondent saying, you feel like if you don't eat meat, you don't eat. So, there needs to be something in, rather than having meat-free Monday, it might be that they were saying, you needed to know what you would eat on a Monday rather than what you wouldn't eat. And a predicted reluctance in the female groups, they spoke about the male members of their families not being happy to not eat meat. However, the male groups, who were not related to the female groups, but they didn't really bring that out as much, but the female groups were worried about keeping the family happy and having enough meat in the diet. So the first quote there talks about people spoke about how over their lifetime people have been eating more and more meat, and that perhaps it was time to start going in the opposite direction. So we've got so much meat around, and people have just got used to eating it all the time now. And then the second one there about the kind of the role of the male members of the household. My boyfriend's always a bit like, there's no meat, it's not a meal. Okay, so then we moved on to lab meat. And unprompted here, we sort of briefly described the idea of growing artificial meat. And all of the groups, in this unprompted way, talked about the potential animal welfare advantages and a kind of willingness to try lab meat. It sounded quite exciting to people, which we were surprised about. We thought that it was much more likely people would be kind of shocked and appalled, but that wasn't the response that we got. And it was also suggested that maybe it would be safer due to increased control, it might be purer, and there could be health benefits. And those are the kinds of ideas our groups came up with. So the kinds of things people were saying, nothing's dead because of it and we still get to eat meat, so I think it's the best of both worlds. If it tastes like meat, no problem. It's probably better than meat itself if they're growing it scientifically, to be perfectly honest. And I know that from our sort of stakeholder events before, that's the kind of discourse that for farmers is maybe particularly alarming, that people think that, you know, animals reared on a farm might be less safe than something grown in a lab. And perhaps, you know, you could delve into that more and look at the disconnect between people's awareness of where their food comes from. So then we spoke about communal eating, and much as lab meat was a surprise that people weren't up in arms, it was a surprise that people really were up in arms about communal eating. It was massively unpopular with every group. It conjured up images of military canteens, slop, school dinners. People were sort of, you know, on the edges of their seats willing to protest about the idea of being forced to eat with their neighbours. Many felt that it would aggravate existing social problems, so whilst we had this sort of sense that it might help build social cohesion and community and food, it really didn't get that reaction right across the groups. And it was also the one option that we presented that people really struggled to get their head around why it would be a sustainable option, because they assumed that it would be wasteful. So rather than the economies of scale that we were talking about, they thought that it would lead to lots of waste. So here we've got the kind of more pleasant things that people said. I personally would probably be very reluctant. It would almost have to be forced upon us. I left shared housing behind when I was a student, and I'm not going back to it. It's almost like a step back. It was really uniformly unliked, the sense of communal eating. Meal replacements. Well, participants didn't feel that pills would fit in with family life. So here we spoke a lot about the social and cultural role of food. They would miss cooking and eating, and the only thing that they could see it for, which is kind of what's already happening, is that you might use that sort of product as part of a weight management program, or if you're in a real hurry and you just needed some kind of fuel rather than food. And there's a good quote here that captures the sort of social and cultural element, that a lot of my day revolves around food, and it's a social thing as well. You meet with friends, you go out for a meal, you cook a meal, you sit down and you talk about your day, don't you? You're not going to sit there over a tablet, are you, saying, oh, this is what I've done today, darling, you know, it's over, let's move on from that. You know, so the people really didn't think that fitted with how they felt about food. And then finally, we spoke about GM. Again, there's a lot of confusion about GM products, whether GM products were or were not available in the UK. Many questioned the safety of GM products, but there was also a sense that it was an inevitable part of the future, that we were moving in that direction. And obviously, you'd have to look at the context of the focus group there. We've spent an hour talking about sustainability, food crises, things like that, and at that point, people are saying that it's an inevitable part of the future. Participants requested more information again on GM, so that's a theme coming through a lot of the topics we spoke about. So there, the inevitability. I don't think we like the idea of GM food, but the way it's going to be. And also the second quote there gets the sense of how controversial GM is, that even people who are quite disconnected with food, who weren't that interested in the sustainability of food, saying things like, I don't know enough about it. I've got no problem with GM food, but a lot of people do have problems with it, don't they? So there must be some issues. So even if you don't quite know what those issues are, you know that it's a controversial topic, potentially. Okay, so the key message. I think before I come on to this, it's worth saying that, you know, in these focus groups, we're talking in a kind of very relaxed, almost nice university room. And people, it's very different to if lab meat was being on a shelf in a supermarket and the papers were picking that up. So, you know, we're not saying this is how people would respond if these things actually happened, but rather a kind of indication of the initial responses and different ways of seeing things that people might have. So, key messages. The high carbon footprint groups were the most engaged and interested. So, the ones that know the most also are in these highest carbon footprint groups. Across all the groups, participants called for more information on most topics. So, you know, mirroring earlier work that people are confused about what a sustainable diet would actually look like. But we would stress that it's perhaps a necessary but not sufficient condition for behavioural change. So we're absolutely not saying that people just knew more, they would do the right thing in terms of their food consumption, and that there are lots of other factors, the structure of people's lives, that have to be taken into account. Participants were much less open to changes that impact on the social and cultural role of eating, but they were open to future changes that had like a kind of win-win. So if there was a money-saving opportunity or animal welfare benefits, those were seen more positively. And in terms of how these things might actually happen, responsibility was seen differently within every group. So people were often looking to government, producers and supermarkets to facilitate their change. They wanted to know more, they wanted to do the right thing, but they didn't know what the right thing was. But for other people who are less engaged with that sustainability side of things, really felt that it should be done for them and they should still be able to go and select whatever they wanted. And really it was up to supermarkets and producers and government to take care of the sustainability problem. Okay, thanks very much.